People are still logging in here, getting my screen readjusted. Thank you all so much for coming back. Okay, so our next session today is, our next presenter is Ada Puches. Ada is the community educator for Champlain Valley Dispensary, one of Vermont's legal medical marijuana dispensaries. Ada provides educational outreach on cannabinoids and the state's medical marijuana program to hospitals, clinics, private healthcare providers, patient groups, and any parties interested in learning about the state-approved medicine. Ada's work history includes advocacy on integrative health practices. And before Ada begins, I just want to share, obviously when we originally planned this presentation, we were going to be in Vermont. So Ada was going to be speaking about the Vermont process. That will still be the case for today. Her expertise is in the Vermont system, but where available, this will, some of the knowledge will be applicable broadly. So let's turn it over to Ada.
Great. Thank you, Katie, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. I might need some hand holding on my ability to share my program.
So you should see at the bottom, there should be a green button that says share screen.
And am I on the Zoom platform?
Yep.
Yep.
It's either at the bottom of your screen or the top.
Got it. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay. Share. Anything?
Yep. Now you just need to go into presentation mode, which I think is down on the bottom. There you go.
Yeah. Perfect. Good.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Thanks for holding my hand, Katie.
No problem.
I want to jump right in. I know we have limited time. I want to jump right in talking to you all about the endocannabinoid system, which many people may have never heard of before, and there's good reason for that. It's not taught still in very many medical schools in the United States, but it is literally the mechanism upon which symptom relief rests. So one of the reasons I always start my presentations with that is because it's very difficult to understand how this plant, really it's an herb, and it's relatively safe, how it became sort of not only pushed off to the side in terms of a medicine, but also how can it possibly help so many different conditions, not just headache disease, but also many, many others that we often hear people using it for. So the endocannabinoid system is a very, very complex physiological system present in all mammals. And we actually know that it's also been present for a very, very long time, thousands of years. And it's biochemically, it's made up of a cannabinoid receptor, a molecule that fits or binds into that receptor, and then the enzymes that come along and either make or break down those molecules. So it's that's a very simplistic way of saying that's the micro mechanism for it. The reason it's so important as we move along is that it's a way to explain that that's what's happening inside of our bodies. So we have our own cannabinoid system, the endocannabinoid system, that's inside everybody's human body. But it's also mimicked, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it's also being mimicked by phytocannabinoids, which is what cannabis and hemp are. The endocannabinoid system, sort of scientifically, its most important responsibility is what is called homeostasis. And really, for our purposes as humans, homeostasis means balanced health. So this incredibly complex system that every human has is always working. It's always trying to pull us back into health. the molecules themselves that attach to our receptors are called cannabinoids. The ones that are in our bodies we call endocannabinoids inside. When they actually fit together, they trigger the homeostasis. But these cannabinoids that can be out in nature, in hemp, in cannabis, and also in echinacea, which kind of makes sense because when you think about it in flu season, a lot of us are being guided to take echinacea. Those are called phytocannabinoids. And basically, they actually mimic. That's what they're doing. They are mimicking our endocannabinoids. They literally fit into those same receptor cells. And so this is what brings about the cascade of potential symptom relief. We don't talk about cures. It's not a cure for anything, but it is what can oftentimes help people feel better, whether it's nausea from chemotherapy, whether it's sometimes pain, as in headache disease, whether it's seizure disorders. We've seen that a lot, whether it's muscle spasticity for MS. This is because these phytocannabinoids are actually sort of boosting up our endocannabinoid system as they mimic them. And of course, we also know that there are some medications that are actually being used that are cannabinoid derived. One of the big things, I think that's an incredible sort of pediment to where we could be with cannabinoids, and in particular with headache disease, is that cannabis is still Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substance Act. It is still federally illegal. It's a little bit hard for us who advocate on the side of cannabis to really understand that logically. Cannabis is not lethal. There is no amount at which you can take it that you can die from it. It has the definition of Schedule 1 is no medical applicability, and also a high degree of addiction. Cannabis is less addictive than caffeine. And as we know, from not just thousands of years of being used therapeutically, but also many, many, many studies that we have today on cannabis and cannabinoids, it has lots of medical applications. So that schedule, though, the Schedule 1, is what has drastically impacted US research on many topics, including migraine. Some studies show that migraine may be due to what we now know as endocannabinoid deficiency or abnormal inflammatory response. What that means in a nutshell is people who would, with their own endocannabinoid system, have a response that's equal to the imbalance within their bodies around this disorder, can't do it, can't quite make enough cannabinoids, endocannabinoids, to bring the body back into homeostasis. And there's lots of different reasons why that might happen, and there's still a lot of mystery around it. But one of the ways in which the researchers have realized is that people with lots of different disorders might be suffering from something called an endocannabinoid deficiency. As we know, people with migraine report headaches that begin with bright lights, hunger, a hormonal imbalance, or certain other triggers. And that in itself causes an imbalance in the brain, which could definitely affect the production of endocannabinoids and someone's ability to maintain or be pulled back into homeostasis. A trigger also, which I mentioned, is the inflammation, which can be yet another cause or invitation for migraine. I want to move just for a little bit into CBD or cannabidiol. It is yet another cannabinoid. So there's THC as a cannabinoid, CBD as a cannabinoid. Those are the two that we hear about a lot. but there are literally dozens of cannabinoids. And the reason to sort of know that that exists is because many people take cannabis or their medicine in what's called a whole plant context. And what that means is that they are taking not just those individual constituents, those individual cannabinoids, but many researchers and clinicians think that it is that whole plant medicine that really actually makes the difference in terms of therapeutic outcomes. So I'm just going to play Katie with this for a second and see if I can move my, yes. So therapeutic, so CBD is therapeutic and non-intoxicating, and it's found in both cannabis and hemp. You don't need a medical card, as many people have seen throughout the last, I think, 2 or 3 years. You can find CBD anywhere. And I would like to recommend that you don't buy it anywhere because it shows up in places like gas stations. And in fact, the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, 2+ years ago, did a big study where they bought a bunch of stuff. They went through and bought a bunch of CBD products, and it turns out when they went back to the lab, very few of those products had CBD in them. CBD's therapeutic qualities actually outnumber THCs, but one is not necessarily better than the other. Full spectrum or whole plant CBD or hemp oil generally refers to products that not only contain CBD, but like I said, they're whole plants, so they contain other things like terpenes, other cannabinoids, minerals, vitamins, proteins, and other plant materials, all of which researchers think lend to therapeutic impact. There's broad spectrum CBD. Oops, excuse me. Oop, I just lost my other slide.
You should be able to click that arrow right under the Miles for Migraine logo. There should be an arrow that lets you.
Oh, thank you. Go backwards. Thank you. I was doing my computer. There's broad spectrum, which is everything except THC, although there might be trace amounts there. But there's isolate CBD in its purest form. And those are completely isolated, extracted, and stripped of any additional cannabinoids, terpenes, and plant components. And people often ask, what's the best thing for me? What should I take? And we're going to talk about dosing in a second, but this really is completely an individual journey. And so for whatever condition you're taking cannabinoids, it really is something that you're going to have to experiment with. Again, when you hold up the fact that THC, actually no cannabinoid is lethal, and it is a relatively safe plant material, and it's provided in lots of different mechanisms for you to take, it is relatively easy to start to experiment. So finding your correct strain or strains, again, you're just going to have to do it, I wouldn't say without guidance, because there's lots of guidance around each, but I'm talking about the two big ones, THC and CBD. There is some really good guidance around where to start. We often, on the THC, the medical side of the house, where you have to get a card in Vermont, we also often talk to people about starting very, very low, and low means microdosing. So under 5 milligrams or under, and then titrating up to get your minimum effective dose without impairment or impacts. Everybody's endocannabinoid system is different, and so it depends on multiple factors such as your overall health, your emotional state, your diet, what I referred to before, your cannabinoid tone or deficiency, and also whether or not you're what we call cannabis naive. Some people have been sort of medicating for themselves, by themselves, for a while, and so they know what their body's relationship is to cannabis. Other people are just, starting out, never having done it before, and those can also lead to sort of different starting points. But in medical cannabis, the rule of thumb is always start low and go slow. And we guide people that way every day. I'm gonna jump, I know that there are many people on this event who are not from Vermont, so I'm just gonna jump to this slide and maybe do a time check around questions, because I also wanna get to as many questions as possible. And I know that in terms of medical cannabis states, every state makes their own rules. So we are federally illegal. There are 33 states that have medical cannabis programs. All of them are different from each other. And people who are not from Vermont, you'll just have to, I would say that the quickest way to get information for your state is to just go into Google and put whatever your state is, New Jersey medical cannabis or medical marijuana program. That is probably the best way to do it. There are some Uber sites that can give you information. One of them that I use a lot is the National Conference of State Legislatures. But things are changing every day in a legislative world, and especially post-COVID, as legislatures and states struggle with the impact of COVID on their resources. I would say that just go directly, if you can, to your states, Google your state and find out what organization within the state structure office is running your medical cannabis program. For purposes of Vermont, cancer, MS, HIV, AIDS, glaucoma, Crohn's, and Parkinson's are the listed conditions, or the treatment of these conditions if the disease or treatment results in severe, persistent, or intractable symptoms. I often think about cancer as a good example of where the treatment is oftentimes gives you more symptoms than the actual disease sometimes. So, so it's those listed conditions or the treatment, if that brings you those symptoms that I just listed. The PTSD is separate from this list in the sense that you have to, it isn't treated exactly the same. It isn't, it's not looked at as the treatment being impairing as well, but it does have an extra condition, which is that you have to provide a document that says that you're actually in psychotherapy or counseling. And then Vermont does have this balloon sort of window, which says a disease or medical condition or its treatment that is chronic, debilitating, and produces one or more of the following intractable symptoms, which is wasting syndrome, chronic pain, severe nausea or seizures. And migraine and headache disease usually fall into that category, the chronic pain category. I am gonna sort of stop there. And then Katie, if you could let me know if we have questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions. Do you have recommendations? You talked actually about, how there's such a variety of types and like good CBD or gas station CBD.
Yeah.
Do you have recommendations on a particular brand or the best place to purchase CBD from?
That's an interesting question. I'll give you some, if the audience doesn't mind, I'll give you a couple of national companies that I think are very, very reputable, and I'll give you some local for Vermont, places that I think are good. Most places, of course, in Vermont, well, now across the country, everybody's sort of shifting during COVID to online purchasing. Two national companies that I like very much and I've worked with for years. One is called Mary's, and it's Colorado-based. They've been doing this work for a very long time. Within the state of Colorado, they do both THC products, which are not available to us outside of Colorado, but they have a very broad line of products that are CBD or hemp derived that are very good quality. The other national company is Charlotte's Web, which is a very famous company, and they've also been doing this work for many, many years, and they're wonderful people. Locally, the company I work for, we do this work, the advocacy work, for free. We do have a CBD, we have a medical dispensary highly regulated by the state of Vermont. And we also have a retail store. The retail store is called Series Natural Remedies. And right now we're selling just online, but you can buy a bunch of different ways in which to take your CBD, including patches and tinctures and oils and topicals. And also Sun Soil is another great Vermont company that I think is awesome and does really wonderful work. And Upstate Elevator is another one that a lot of patients really like.
Great. Those are all good suggestions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this one or not. This is a question. Do you have any ideas why workers' comp will not accept edibles to be reimbursed, especially since many CBD or medical marijuana users cannot inhale due to separate medical issues?
Yeah, I would say that that's because it's federally illegal.
Okay. Question here is, I live in a different state than my headache specialist. How does that work if our state laws are not the same? So can a provider from out of state, like let's say between Vermont and New York, if the headache specialist in Vermont and the patient lives in New York, how does that work?
Well, if the patient lives in Vermont, they can actually see a specialist who lives in one of our border states. So, you know, our program, our Vermont state program, can only sort of legislate over our citizens.
Yeah.
And so if you're in Vermont and you see somebody along our border, in one of our border states, that's fine. They can sign for the registry, but it's not vice versa. We can't, our state can't control residents of another state.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
For that person, yeah, for that person, they would want to check if their doctor is in a neighboring state to their state. It's possible that their state would cover it. But if they're, for example, traveling between Vermont to see a specialist in Pennsylvania, that's probably not going to work.
Right.
For the Vermont dispensary anyway.
For the Vermont, yeah, for the Vermont program, yeah. And like I said before, there's 33 states that have medical marijuana programs. They're all different. But I'm not an expert on any of the other ones because it's a lot that's very different.
Do you have a recommendation for a website where people can learn more about the terpenes and what works for pain?
Absolutely. Two of my all-time favorite websites, one is called healer.com, HEALER.com. And that is the website of Dr. Dustin Sulak. He's actually a clinician in Maine. He's very well known throughout the country, actually. And he lectures a lot. He works a lot with researchers that are super famous, like Dr. Ethan Russo. And he puts enormous amounts of content up on healer.com for free. Highly recommend that site. My other favorite is Project CBD, which is a nonprofit. It's sort of an educational clearinghouse. And both those sites together, I mean, everyone who's ever sort of Googled anything about cannabis or medical cannabis, it's overwhelming. But both of those sites are really quite good.
I know also for people with migraine, I don't know if you've heard of there's a Facebook group called, I think it's called Migraine Buds. So it's a conversation with people, you know, specific to migraine and medical marijuana. It's not run by a provider, but it's another resource for you to check out. What was the government website you recommended for people who are not in Vermont, Ada?
Oh yes, the National Conference of State Legislatures.
Okay.
So that'll give you, you know, the best thing obviously is to just Google what your state has, but in terms of the rest of the country, that has pretty good information about where individual states are.
Since CBD is not federally regulated, how do states that allow CBD provide guidance for its users? Do they rely on the expertise of the provider? Are there studies contracted at the state level?
Oy. Okay, yeah. So CBD is an almost more complicated story than THC in many ways. And right now we are pretty much unregulated, I would say. I would say the government's not going to help us very much with CBD. They actually were several steps behind because I don't know how much people followed the whole CBD story, but up until very recently, December of 2018, I believe, CBD was encapsulated in hemp, and hemp was encapsulated in Schedule 1. And so when the Farm Bill of 2018 broke loose hemp, it sort of carried with it in a hidden little satchel CBD, and then all of a sudden the FDA said, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't. We're not saying that you can put all this out on a shelf. We don't know how safe this is, yada yada yada." And we do know that it's pretty safe. The World Health Organization has been looking at it for several years. It is not completely harmless, but it's relatively safe. Where the harm comes in, I would say, is CBD goes through your liver and is metabolized in your liver along with like 60% of the pharmaceuticals that we take. And so there is some definite evidence for interactions, either blocking some of our pharmaceuticals or sort of hyper metabolizing them. So general rule of thumb with that is similar to those medications like blood thinners and statins, where you would not eat grapefruit and take your medication. That's sort of the category that CBD falls into with your liver. We always tell people, have conversations with your healthcare providers if you're on those types of medications. But going back to sort of the guidance, we went through a very muddy period. We're sort of probably still in a somewhat of a muddy period with CBD and government guidance, because the FDA sort of said we're in charge, and then they realized they are so far behind the necessary research. A, it was locked in Schedule 1, so there was not a lot of money or interest. B, it's non-intoxicating. CBD does not make you high, so it's the one that nobody cared about in terms of research. Because remember that our history of research is really in this country, because of Schedule 1, it really is about what harm are cannabinoids doing, not what good are cannabinoids doing. So, so I would say we're not quite, and we may never be at the place where you can get guidance from our government, our national government, on CBD. I think there's some decent information that comes out of providers of the products themselves, and places like healer.com, which is run by a clinician who has worked in this field for over a decade. Anything that you can read by, if you Google and read Dr. Ethan Russo, who's an international expert on cannabinoids, is worth it. And of course, Project CBD.
Thank you so much. I think you made an important point too, that we all need to be reminded of, with whether it's supplements or CBD. Just because it's not a prescription doesn't mean you don't need to check with your provider, because there can always be, things that don't work well together. And so you want to be really careful about that. It's not just because you can get it anywhere doesn't mean it's safe with whatever else you're taking.
Right, right. And I would add on to that, Katie, in my advocacy work, some of the things that I really want to invite people to think about doing is talking to their providers about either their current use of cannabinoids or their desire to use cannabinoids. One of the challenges we have is that because the endocannabinoid system is not taught in very many medical schools at all in this country, doctors aren't educated, and other healthcare providers are not educated about cannabinoids. And so, and that added with it's Schedule 1, added with, and if they learn anything in medical school, it's that it's a drug of abuse. The THC is a drug of abuse. All of these things have really steered this entire field into a corner that, as we now know, is not useful. People are using these things either in conjunction with their healthcare provider or separately. And we don't want people to use it separately. We want this to come into the mainstream. We want THC to be descheduled. We want it to be looked at like it is in other countries. There are other countries that have made it legal, and they are outstripping us in terms of research.
There's a question here. Have you heard of, it sounds like a brand called Cannabis Therapy, and does it matter about GMP certification?
GMP certification. GMP, is that I'm not familiar with GMP certification.
Okay.
Is that for us? Oh, I was going to ask, is that sort of a supplement?
Oh, good manufacturing practice.
Yep. And Katie, you might know more about GMP than I do. I know that it's a classification that some people don't think of as being very deep, but I'm not great on the supplement side of the world.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with it either, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I can't speak to that.
Okay, I don't think we have any other questions right now. This was really helpful, Ada. I think we could probably talk with you all day long. So thank you so much.
I'll definitely come back. So.
All right, thank you.